We're going to launch right in by talking more about the survey and about the state of the all-volunteer force and about the state of the ongoing work of Wounded Warriors. Just an additional brief word or two of logistics and introduction from me. First of all, we do have a hashtag for this if you're interested on Twitter, WWP Survey, all one word. We'll go until about 11:30 this morning, and the second half of our conversation will be with you. So please be thinking ahead to what you'd like to ask the panel. And then we'll have General Linnington able to speak with some reporters if anybody wants to ask General Linnington any questions afterwards. We'll have a little press gaggle here in the room. But let's launch in, and let me first add a word of introduction. General Linnington already mentioned about each of the three distinguished panelists. Melanie has a PhD in health and human performance, and starting from the far and works on Wounded Warrior Project issues, across the board. And Keita Franklin has been the suicide prevention official at both DOD and Department of Veterans Affairs, and has her background as well in social work and in related fields of human psychology and well-being. Tony Curta is a graduate of the Naval Academy, so balancing the general, and we know we've got important events coming up in that domain. I think Saturday, if that's not mistaken.
Exactly right.
And after a distinguished career in the Navy, rising to Rear Admiral, he retired, and he's been now working personnel issues one way or another, including up to the responsibilities of the Undersecretary of Defense at the Pentagon for the last half decade or so. So we could not have a more distinguished panel, and I thought the best way to begin, Melanie, is to ask about the survey itself, and we've got a lot of the quick statistics flashing across the screen, so that's a little bit of an introduction, but I think you can add some more detail and let us know a few more of the key findings, and also where you're seeing important trends, because the statistics by themselves often don't mean as much as understanding where we're seeing movement, right, and where we're seeing progress, and where we still have a lot of work left to do. So if you could begin with some highlights, please.
Absolutely. Well, first, thank you all for being here today, and thank you for having me on the panel. As you saw, there's a lot of information that we've collected, and it started with that idea of we really wanted to understand who is it that we're serving. What do these warriors have as their experiences? What are their most pressing needs? That way we could tailor our programs and services specifically to those needs and being able to move forward. So back in 2009, we worked in collaboration both with Brand and Westat to develop what you see today, this comprehensive survey looking at domains of well-being that specifically focus mental health, physical health, and economic empowerment, so that we could have a pulse on really who is it that we're serving, and then how can we see that we're making an impact in their lives. We launched our first survey in 2010, and we've been able to use the data as not only an internal check on needs and being able to make some adjustments for the programs and services, but we're able to track what are the changes that are needed going forward. Some of the big areas where we have highlighted particular importance is the presence of mental health. I don't think for anybody in this room that's a surprise. The prevalence of mental health. We've seen this year that 78% of those that we serve endorse PTSD as an injury that they incurred post their service. That's not an unusual or a new trend. This is a number that is slightly increasing year over year, but is something that is continuing to present itself, and I'm sure we'll touch more on the importance of mental health as we move forward. But we've used that information as far as allocating our resources to the direct programs and services that Wounded Warrior Project delivers. Specifically, in 2015, we launched the Warrior Care Network, which is an innovative 2 to 3 week intensive mental health program to help get at not only the mental health concerns, but to overcome some of the barriers that we've seen with access to care. And that's been fantastic in addressing some of those concerns. We've also seen that warriors are not as healthy as we would like. Aside from their injuries, we see high rates of obesity, lack of physical activity, and as a result of warriors being fearful of incurring additional injuries, as well as not being comfortable in social situations, we've implemented specific programming at Wounded Warrior Project. It's a 90-day coaching plan that helps warriors get physically active, learn better nutrition, but do it in a safe space that's aware of their injuries and limitations that they face. Lastly, we've used the data from these surveys over the previous years to deprioritize the programming that we provide related to education. As we've seen year over year in the survey, warriors are doing a great job attaining higher levels of education. This year we hit the largest number of individuals receiving a bachelor's degree or higher, just at 36%, and that's a trend that has been continuing to increase year over year. So we saw that education wasn't a barrier to employment. Instead, what we saw were the barriers were, again, mental health issues. So with that, we emphasized, again, mental health programming and put additional resources and internal programming as well as the partnership with the academic medical centers for the Warrior Care Network. So it's a lot of information, but we've used the data year over year to improve what we're doing because we're understanding who we're serving.
It's fantastic. Before I go to the Admiral for thinking about how all these issues relate to the... Before I go to the Admiral, to talk about the current all-volunteer force and where we stand. I'm not smart enough to be able to talk in here at the same, so I'll just give it a second. I'd like to follow up with a couple of the specifics and make sure we get some of the broader picture here that as you see the future policy agenda, because obviously you're working with Wounded Warrior Project, which has a huge population, but you're also in many ways learning from and teaching the rest of the U.S. ecosystem that works with veterans, the Department of Veterans Affairs. You're trying to, in some ways, address problems that they're also addressing. You're learning from each other. You're watching the needs. And I want to ask about the Department of Veterans Affairs and its evolution. And of course, we've got Keita working with them, and we'll come to her later. But it strikes me that there is some pretty good news in the poll about people's happiness with access compared to maybe where it was a few years ago. And I wanted to ask if you could comment on that. I know it gets away a little bit from the immediate activities that you do at Wounded Warrior Project, but your survey allows us to understand how veterans feel about the Department of Veterans Affairs. And this has been a big policy debate. We've had previous discussions at Brookings on this as well. We know there's been a choice program developed for veterans, so they've got easier access to the private sector, but VA has also really worked to improve access within the system, which of course would be its preference to be able to serve as much as possible. So can you just say a word about that whole set of issues, how well the Department of Veterans Affairs is now connecting with the needs in real time in a prompt way of our veteran population?
Absolutely. The access to care continues to be a challenge. However, when they are receiving care, that is a bright spot. This year that we've seen that over 75% of warriors that we serve do access mental health care from the VA, or they have that ability to, with over 68% choosing that to be their primary source of health care. That's a number that we are continuing to see increase year over year. Reasons that they're doing that is because they feel that they're entitled to it, but that it's also their ability, the VA's ability to treat their service-connected injuries. So that we're seeing that as a positive movement in that area. We've also seen a marked decline in the challenges that warriors are experiencing with respect to scheduling appointments. There's still an opportunity there where they're having difficulty getting in at hours and rectifying their schedules with the VA's appointment availability, but we're now hovering down around the 30 percentile versus upwards of 50% of individuals reporting difficulty getting either mental or physical health care through the VA system. So the changes that are being made, the opportunities for warriors to get their needs met is improving year over year. There's still room. I wouldn't say that it's been resolved. However, we are seeing positive momentum, and I know that that's something that Keita and team are continuing to keep a focus on.
So yes, and we'll come back to Keita in a minute on some of these issues after talking first with Tony. But I also wanted to just one last thing about trends in the data, just because there is such a wealth of information in your survey. And I've been studying it the last few weeks to get ready for today, but trying to really organize some of the key trends and facts in my mind. And so I've seen hopeful trends in terms of access to education. We saw the numbers on home ownership going dramatically upward in recent years, which is good news. Homelessness has gone substantially down, I believe been cut roughly in half. But I also wanted to ask you specifically on the issue of employment. And we've seen a reduction in veteran unemployment rates, I think of a few percentage points over the last half decade. But of course, the national unemployment rate's also been trending downward. So how do you put that in context. I think we have, 12% or so veteran unemployment, which is substantially higher, of course, than the overall national number of about 5%, but the trend has at least been in the right direction. How do you think about that overall statistic?
Absolutely. I think that it is promising that our trend is paralleling what's happening not only in the general population, but also among the entire veteran population. But considering that those that we serve in our subset is those that have been most impacted by war, and so those are the wounded, injured, and ill, I don't think it's a surprise that we're still hovering at a higher rate than both the general average and the veteran, although, again, it's mirroring that. So I think it definitely is a positive takeaway that we're getting warriors into the workforce, and we're recognizing what are some of those challenges that we're facing and being able to put programs and services in place that can help them overcome, because we see mental health issues and difficulty being around others being a primary force that is holding warriors back from either entering the workforce or changing jobs within the workforce.
And that's specifically in your survey for the wounded warrior population that participates. Great.
Exactly.
Thank you very much for all of that. And Admiral, Mr. Secretary, if I could go to you and now try to connect these issues, which are primarily about the post-active duty demographic, to what you're dealing with day in and day out in terms of maintaining a ready force for the country's security today. And I realize I just want to ask you to connect these two issues, which are closely linked but different, right? The well-being of the veterans population and certainly the wounded warrior population is in many ways a different group from those in service today. And yet, I know you have both groups on your mind. You're trying to make sure that you take care of today's men and women so they will not be permanently incapacitated to the extent they have problems, they get treatment, they have the ability to heal. So you're trying to deal with all these issues within the medical world, within the world of how many times you ask people to deploy, what that does for their proclivity for PTSD. So I'm just trying to put out a few issues and ask you to help us connect them, the linkages between the wounded warrior population and today's active duty military. And thank you again for joining us.
Well, thank you, Michael, for having me and for allowing me to participate in this. And obviously, you know, the care of our wounded warriors is one of our most sacred obligations, not just to the Department of Defense, but, you know, the country. We kind of have a compact with people when they put their lives on the line for the country. And if they're wounded, you know, in that effort, we owe them, you know, our best efforts across the board. And so the wounded warrior population is very, very important to us. And, you know, the way in which we live up to that compact obviously helps us sustain the all-volunteer force into the future. We've had an all-volunteer force now for about 45 years. It was the early 70s when we went from the, you know, a conscription force to an all-volunteer force. And I'm not sure when it was envisioned that we thought the all-volunteer force as it's constituted today would endure or be successful in 17 years of war. And the nature of the conflict is much different than we've seen in the past in the Koreas and the Vietnams and the World Wars. The nature of casualties are a little bit different, but the all-volunteer force has been kind of remarkably resilient. And I mean, where we are today, we have the highest quality we've ever had. Despite having a good economy, we're still largely meeting the numbers that we need of folks coming in. Our retention, those that we bring in through the front door, are staying, again, at record numbers. They want to continue to serve their force, and all of that is very important to us. And so the all-volunteer force is generally in a very, very strong state, if you will, today. But the nature of the conflict over the past 17 years, particularly since the force has professionalized, the volunteer force is an all-professional force as well, to including our medical force. Our medical force is really much more, I won't say they're much more professional than in the past, but the resources and the way to respond on the battlefield has also changed, you know, the nature of our wounded warrior population from prior conflicts. Frankly, those injured on the battlefield today would not have necessarily made it in past conflicts. I mean, the medical capabilities have just been tremendous. And so that's changed a bit, you know, the nature of our wounded warrior population. We get them immediate care on the battlefield. We take them to someplace like Landstuhl. We get them we get them back here, and that's when the process starts. And it's a like we like to say in the Navy, an all hands process. DoD has a role. Certainly, the Veterans Affairs has a huge role, but all of society and all our MSOs and VSOs, like the Wounded Warrior Project, play a very, very important part as we, as a nation, live up to that compact for those who have put their lives on the line and been injured in the process. And so the survey like this is just very, very valuable insight for us and what we can do better inside DoD, and mostly that goes in how do we transition those wounded warriors that will go out into society? How do we ensure their care in the VA, if that is where they choose to go, or some of them go out into the rest of society outside of our embrace, our immediate embrace, and out into the civilian world. And we have to keep track of them too. And so again, this survey is an instrument into how they're faring, what issues they face, and it really helps us as we work mostly with the VA, but other agencies on the transition of all our veterans from uniform life to that civilian life. This is a special subset of that population that deserves special care, special attention, make sure they have everything they need, whether it's in the VA or out in the other worlds.
Fantastic. Thank you. We look forward to continuing the discussion as we get into the audience Q&A as well. But Keita, first, if I could ask you, first of all, just your take on what you might have seen out of the survey this morning and any previous chance you had to study it. What jumps out at you, given your special responsibilities and service in the Department of Veterans Affairs? And then I want to ask a couple of specific questions about the Veterans Affairs system, if I could as well.
Sure. Thank you so much. And I'm also pleased to be on the panel this morning. A big thank you to the Wounded Warrior Project for your leadership on producing such a valuable, actionable set of data, not only for Wounded Warrior to take action on, but I think also for organizations like my own and other nonprofit organizations that work in this space. It's just such a great resource tool for the way ahead. So when I study the findings, I mean, some of the things that have great relevance for me are things that protect people from suicide, but also just help them create a life worth living, or things that give them hope in participating in a life, productive, meaningful life. And one of the first things that we've spoke about already was this issue around employment. And we talk a lot about employment being a risk factor for suicide, and things like housing and homelessness and anything that can stabilize a veteran is all for good. But when you dig deep into the employment, I think we don't always recognize what a big protective factor that is, because people that are gainfully employed are engaged in often in something that they feel a mission and a purpose and a sense of value, and it can parallel their military time, where they had this unit cohesion. If we can get them to a place where they're engaged in meaningful employment, where they have fun, friendship, sense of purpose, mission, belongingness, also practical things like healthcare and a predictable routine, and contributions that they feel positive about. So I think that's a protective factor across multiple layers, and you see in the data where employment has gone up, and equally so education, which I think also coexists often with employment, as we have more people leaving with higher degrees of education that then get them into an employment that they feel good about. So I think those are the things that just resonated with me right quick, but I'm also hoping we can talk more about the access issues. So.
Yeah. Actually, I want to follow up with both you and Melanie on the question of how we help. The survey has shown how many of the issues are psychological and are emotional and are about community and a sense of purpose. And these are often individuals who are struggling after injury, and perhaps after traumatic brain injury or PTS. So there may be psychological challenges to their sort of navigating the world and the workforce. Can you just sort of as a primer for those of us who don't live this stuff and don't know it as well as we'd like to, can you, maybe starting with you, Keita, help us understand the process by which the VA system or organizations like Wounded Warrior Project can sort of be the life Sherpa, if you will, for someone who needs help? In other words, not just providing the medical service or the psychological counseling or the medication, but sort of the guidance and the the role of a mentor or a friend or a helper to go through those applications, to just hang with it, to think about career options. To what extent are we doing a good enough job there? To what extent can we do better? And what are the mechanisms that presently exist? If I could begin with you, Keita.
Sure. It is such a good question because I think that people have this, anyways, lay people that don't work in this space think the VA is about healthcare. And if we can just get people funneled into the healthcare door, all will be well. But really, we know that healthcare alone, I mean, you see it in the survey data, healthcare is critically important in getting people in the door at the right time, at the right place, when they need it most, with an on-time appointment and provider, and that system is critically important. But I will tell you, it's bigger than that. And so looking at all social aspects, the VA performing in a vehicle to connect veterans to veteran service organizations and to peer support entities. We often have peer support capabilities built right into the system where they can connect to one of their own back in their home state or whatever, as well as social care and connecting with others. Also, access to employment through our connections with other federal agencies like the Department of Labor. It is really like a holistic, I think, view, and navigating it can be difficult, and we should talk more about that. But it's not just a one track for just healthcare.
Do you sort of need one more question? Then I'm going to same ones to Melanie. Do you sort of need to know or have somebody who's your brother or your friend or whatever figure out how to do this, or does the system provide that counselor, that guide? I mean, separate from the doctor, the psychologist, is there somebody who just says, okay, your success in life is now part of my job, and sort of stays with whatever small number of people would be their charge? Or is that a concept that just exists in my mind and doesn't really exist in the system, except where there may just be an individual, an empathetic, caring individual who takes that job upon him or herself, sort of on a one-off basis, if you see what I'm asking?
Yeah, we've made great improvements in this space, working also with Mr. Kurt over the last few years to get after this exact issue, because I don't think it's been as solid as perhaps it could have been in times past. And so the current administration has rolled out with this executive order to improve access to mental health care, particularly during the first 12 months after leaving active duty, in such a way that we want it to be barrier-free, hassle-free. When people want mental health care, it's not the time for us to be sort of giving them a pile of paperwork to fill out and having them, sort of go into the wild yonder with a bureaucratic process. That is not the goal or intent of the VA system. And so we've now, with this new executive order, shared across the enterprise, if it's within the first 12 months, regardless of eligibility, just come in the door and we'll treat you and you'll get care in that critical first 12 months to get after those bumps and the clumsiness that can happen in when you're first learning your new role as a veteran. I would offer that there's always room for improvement in this space. Peer support does help, but you need to seek it out. It's not readily given to you. So it's a complex issue, I think. I don't know if you'd have more to say about that too.
Yeah, one of the things that we find is, and you can see this while the survey and what you saw on the slides earlier, there's a lot of data that's from a numeric perspective. But in the back of the survey, there's a lot of anecdotal feedback in a qualitative sense. And there is where we hear the warriors' voices directly, and they're highlighting the challenges that they face with that transition process. So transitioning from active duty to the civilian sector, and with respect to attaining employment, and what are those paths, getting education. And so there is some lack of clarity and uncertainty. So as an organization, we have oftentimes many points of entry, but regardless of if you enter through our resource center, you get connected at an event because you've attended with a friend who's a member or an alumni with us, that anybody in the organization can ask the right questions to understand what are some of the challenges, and it may be the things that you're not saying instead of the things that you are saying, and get you connected with a variety of teammates that can help you on that journey and identifying, okay, I hear that you're not employed, but I also hear that that's not necessarily your primary concern, that you're really facing some obstacles about getting out in public, and then you get connected with our mental health programs and services. So again, very much a collaborative effort of really listening to what is it that the warrior needs and being able to make the right recommendations for that individual warrior. So there's not a specific path or journey per se, but where are they at that moment, and how can we get them to that ultimate destination of where they want to be so that they could live their life to their fullest potential.
Do you happen to see any breakdown in the statistics on the high number of veterans who say that psychological challenges or emotional barriers or reluctance to go out and be in public, these are on their mind? And as you noted, this has been a big part of the survey, the centrality of these issues. I don't want to suggest that the physical challenges are unimportant, but what's striking to me as sort of a relatively new student of your survey is just how much many of the problems do center on these questions of emotion and psychology, and some of it related to TBI and PTS, but some of it just a more general sort of human challenge of dealing with life after service. Do you find that people who are in certain kinds of communities do better than others? In other words, maybe they're around more fellow veterans, maybe they are more in their hometowns or went back to where they used to be. I mean, is there any kind of a tendency that tends to improve the prospects for people overcoming these challenges and feeling a little bit happier about where they are? And I can begin with you, Melanie, but maybe come back to Kita as well.
Sure, I think that's a really great point. Unfortunately, with the scope of the survey, we aren't able to drill down to those specific details of where are they? Are they back where they had lived prior to their service and what that connection point looks like? But there is a specific data point that looks at, and it's over half of warriors that leverage a peer to help address their mental health concerns. So I think that speaks volume about the importance of that connection and those relationships in not only having a sense of camaraderie, but also dealing with the heavy stuff.
Yep, good. Kita, please.
The only other piece I can think about this that's important to share is a little bit the opposite of your question in terms of what doesn't work, and it's rural areas. Rural areas are a particular risk for accessing care, and I don't think that the survey sliced by rural demographic populations, but it is something to think about. In part, what just kicks in is the practical nature of, is there available services in the area? How quickly can they get to it? Do they have transportation issues? Are there other barriers that come with just being in a rural area?
By the way, that makes me ask, just as a quick follow-up, it may sound like a narrow question, but it's an intriguing one. We have a separate debate in this country about rural broadband and how important it should be for,
yes.
And it's not usually related to this issue, but maybe there is a connection. I realize that human beings need to see each other, be close to each other, look in each other's eyes, touch each other,
yes.
And so maybe broadband can't compensate for distance, but to the extent that it could be a partial, ameliorating factor, do you see any evidence that veterans in rural areas are able to access care through the internet in a way that's at least partly what they need?
It's, again, this is a hot topic also in the field for a couple different reasons. The first is, I think service members leave the military with a I can do it myself mentality, and we should let them when they can. And so if they want to access mental health care or self-surveys or depression screener, if they want to read something about how to get help, that should be readily available. Also, we have telehealth. And so we're trying to push more for telehealth, and so accessing broadband, and that has implications as well. Most recently, we're seeing in some of the suicide data the importance of social media for social support. And so we do see that people will reach out for help on social media, and so access to it in that way can be helpful. We're seeing that veterans in particular will list, even when they're at risk and they're struggling with something, they will post this on public domain, and so it becomes a platform for engagement as well. So it's multi-layered, and for all reasons of having good access, I think improves lives, and so it is, I know, a tough issue. Comcast has been trying to take it on as well.
Good. Either of you two wish to comment?
If I may, I'd like to pick up on something that Melanie said, and it's about that. It's the peer support.
Yes.
And with the all-volunteer force, it's less than 1% of Americans that are, in uniform today and bearing the burden, of our wars, and it leads to some would say somewhat of a civil-military divide. With the the military thinking that civilians don't understand those in uniform and the life that they lead, and some of the civilians say, well, you're in a separate culture and you don't know how to operate out here in the civilian world. And so one of the things of the survey that jumped out at me was the way that the respondents felt about being able to discuss with their peers, whether it's mental health issues or anything else. We know in that transition from life in uniform to life on the outside, that the availability of somebody who's been through it, somebody that speaks your language, somebody that has done what you're about to do is very important. And Keedy and I have been working in this space for years, an increasing number of services in DoD, VA, and much of what we do jointly is now peer-based, whether it's not just for the wounded warriors, but for all of them. And I think that helps, and that's also why our military service organizations, our veteran service organizations are so important in that all-hands effort, because they're largely folks that have walked in these shoes beforehand, and it's very important, and it's manifesting itself in the policy sphere as we do more and more things, getting former veterans or current veterans, but people that have already transitioned into helping those that are transitioning today.
And that's going to lead me to my last question for all of you before we go to the audience. But I wanted to ask you though, Keedy, before my bigger question, which is going to be, what can the rest of us do? And do the surveys suggest what veterans would have us do? Because quite often the questions of that type are framed in terms of official government policy, and that's an important debate. But there's also a question of what individuals can do and what other communities, NGOs can do, just as to be good citizens and reach out to the veteran population. So I want to come back and ask you each that question. But first, Keedy, just so we have the additional statistics on the table, even though it's not in the survey for obvious reasons, but can you tell us the trends in suicide statistics in recent years among veterans that we should be aware of as we think about this problem as well?
Yes, I'll try to go over it really quickly because we could go into it here, but I'm sure everybody's heard about the 20 a day. So this is 20 veterans a day that end their life by suicide. You should know that six of those 20 have received health care in the VA healthcare system in the days and months leading up to their death, and 14 have not. So they don't come to VHA, as we call it, veteran healthcare. They get their healthcare through other places, or they've just not touched our healthcare system yet. And so this is something to be aware of as well. We're seeing, when we break down the numbers, the national numbers for veteran suicide, we're seeing an increased rate within 18 to 34-year-olds, which is why the work that Mr. Curtis spoke about with regard to the transition and the collaboration between DoD is so important, because my civilian counterparts often focus on men over the age of 55 as a high-risk group. But for me in the VA and with my partners on the DoD side, 18 to 34-year-olds, this rate has increased by 10% over the last 2 years, 5% each year over the last 2 years. And so we think that it may have something to do with making sure we're transitioning them well, or perhaps there's more we can do to prepare them for a successful transition. We are also seeing an increased rate with female veterans, which is also not something that my civilian counterparts are often dealing with. We always hear this data point in my field that says that females attempt more with less lethal means, like perhaps medication, and that males complete more. And so the fact that our female veteran rate is 1.8 times higher than their non-veteran counterpart is something that we're concerned about when we see the rate. I'm trying to think if there would be anything. I'm happy to talk more in depth about the data, but your key takeaway is 18 to 34. Females, rural areas, we have increased rates in rural areas. Also,
opioids, more opioids?
Yes, opioids and mental health. We see about half of our veterans that end their life by suicide have a known mental health issue, and about half don't. So, which is why it calls for a comprehensive approach that brings mental health to bear with substance abuse issues, as well as life issues around employment and transition, and peer support, and all of those things become important.
And that 20-a-day number's been there for a while now, about that level, hasn't it?
Yes, it has. It has. In times past, it was 22. It's gone down to 20. You should also know that within that data, running it by day is not good. just because it's not good, because it's not 20 a day. Sometimes it's 26 and sometimes it's 10, but that's the mean average. About between 1.6 or so is active duty on those roles as well. As we've learned more and unpacked the data more, we see that the way that we've run the analysis, active duty numbers are in there. In part, they're also veterans because they've likely had a combat deployment and the like.
And obviously, if it's the younger group, it's also the Iraq-Afghanistan veterans group, as opposed to 10 years ago, it might have been primarily that group, but still some Vietnam era as well.
Yes, and so you can think about that and why it's so important for organizations that, like the Wounded Warrior Project, that serve this group. Critically important, yeah.
So my last question, and I'm sure people in the audience will compliment and ask better questions than I am, but just to begin that transition to everyone else here, I wanted to ask, again, what we can do as individuals in the United States, those of us who are aware of how much the 1% do for us and are not in that 1% ourselves, and may be willing to pay our taxes and otherwise do the things we're supposed to do at a federal level to support all the institutions, but also may want to know what we can do in our own personal lives. Do you see any hints at that from the data in the surveys? Do you have any other ideas you would offer? I know the Wounded Warrior Project does amazing work. There are other groups that try to help, like Welcome Home Veterans and other such groups, Welcome Back Veterans. But there are probably missing areas where we could do more with NGOs. There are probably areas where people can just be more sensitive to how they can help a veteran in their daily lives. Anything you'd want to offer along those lines, maybe starting with you, Melanie, and just working down the row.
Sure. I think that the first step for anybody either in the space or just in the general population is creating that awareness and understanding the population. So familiarizing yourself with what are the experiences that these individuals have faced, and what are some of the challenges as well as some of the triumphs that they're having. And I think really creating that balanced profile is really important. So while there are a variety of mental health and physical health challenges that we've highlighted, there's also a lot of great success stories. So I think that's really a critical takeaway, but also recognizing the importance. We talked about peer support, but creating a general social network of support is really important as well. We're fortunate to see that over 8 in 10 warriors in our population feel that they have people to turn to, and that they have someone that they could trust if they were having an issue or a problem. So continuing to build that network and that community at the local level, and reaching out to those that have served and creating that insulating function that Keita has spoken about, I think is really critical.
Super. Tony.
Well, we talk about the all-volunteer force only being, less than 1%, and that's true. And so many will say, well, how do I even interact with somebody in uniform? But you have to remember, between the active guard and the reserve, the National Guard, the folks are in uniform in every community in this country. And our veterans are in every community of this country. And while there's no, silver bullet that we can point to make progress on this, I would say, in general, it's be a good, concerned, educated citizen wherever you are in your community, because there are veterans there, there's likely folks in uniform there, and whatever's going on in that community, whether it's with the MSOs and the VSOs, whether it's the state VA, the national VA, your National Guard, there's something going on in that community that interacts with veterans or those in uniform. And so just be an involved citizen, know what's going on, and interact with everybody. And that conversation and reducing that perceived divide between those in uniform or those that have worn the uniform, the veterans, and the rest of the civilian population, it will help.
And of course, just one more thing before we come to you, Keita, for the same question, which you mentioned, Tony, that the active and reserve component force is everywhere, but the veteran population really is everywhere. And just to get, I'm sure most people in this room have a sense of the magnitude of the numbers, but we have about 3 million people, or 2.5 million wearing the uniform today, active or reserve. Right. We've got 10 times that number who are veterans, right? So in this country, there are, I believe, more than 25 million military veterans. So the veteran population really is everywhere. And if you look, you will find, exactly. No doubt. Exactly. Keita, over to you.
No, such a good question, too. I appreciate it because you're asking, what could others in the room do and what could the nation do? And for me, in my small part of the world and problem that I'm trying to get after. It is a national issue. I mean, we talk a lot about this being a veteran issue, but suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the nation. And we've saw it happen on the national stage, like you've seen that with Anthony Bourdain, Kate Spade. There's been a number of them that really highlight that it crosses all demographic bounds. It's not like an E1 to E4 solely issue. It's not a veteran issue. So I do appreciate the question. We have a campaign inside the VA and with the DoD called Be There. And it is really what the nation could do if we could rally the whole nation around being there for veterans in all that they do. And so I think Mr. Curtis said it very well in terms of like at your local community, be there for veterans. When you're at work, be there for veterans. And what does that mean? It means like small acts, coffee, fun, friendship, mental health appointments, transportation. It means everything. Be there for veterans. And so, train yourself, know the data, similar to what my colleague talked about, be aware and then use it to take action at your level, wherever your level is. And if you're stuck and you're unsure, reach us because we're also all about partnering and helping you build the capacity to be there too. So
great, thank you.
Good question.
A great answer. Okay, so let's please go to you. We've got microphones. Please wait for one once we call on you and identify yourself, please. And we'll take 2 or 3 questions per round and then come back to the panel. So who would like to begin, please? Got a gentleman up here in both the 3rd and 2nd rows. Take those 2.
Hi. Questions for Keita. I'm Steve Rout from Coda Support Foundation. I was fortunate enough last year to sit in on a roundtable, the VA Mental Health Roundtable, and then this year as well. 2 years ago, we discussed briefly on my active duty time a periodic post-deployment health reassessment or a periodic health reassessment and introduced the idea of perhaps the VA going down a similar path, sending something out to veterans. As a veteran, I know that the outreach from the VA is, or the presence is there, but I would say that it's promulgated and instigated by me going to the VA instead of the VA perhaps sending me or sending all veterans a periodic health assessment. And then for data purposes, is that something that the VA would pursue too? Because then obviously you've got self-reporting potentially about suicidal thoughts and ideation as well.
Let me take one more and then come back to the panel. We'll start with you once we get the other question, please.
Sure, Don.
Can we get a microphone?
I'll speak loudly.
They're recording it, so we want to record you for posterity.
Right, let me do this. So the Navy I joined and the Navy I retired from were 2 different aspects about how we socialized. And what I'm seeing now, what we're seeing across the board, American Legions, VFWs, social organization Elks, can't get the IAVA crowd out. So I was wondering, is there something, you're dealing with the crowds that we're looking for, people that can get out and do things. Is there some way that you're reaching out that's working well? Because I think the way that you touch the younger crowd and how they socialize is just a lot different.
Great, thank you. Do you want to start with whatever fraction of those you'd like to, and then we'll work down the panel?
Yes, I'm happy to, and I'd love to hear from others too. This issue is such a good question of he's asking about periodic health assessments, and that's a term that the service members know well, right? Like you go in and get your PDHRA, and that resonates with folks. And he's asking, it's a similar methodology. Why can't the VA do it over the lifespan? And it's such a, I think, a beautiful solution set in terms of being proactive and reaching out and scheduling folks. No different than your own. Those of you that are civilians might get a card in the mail that you have a dental and get brought back in or as part of a periodic check. I don't know that we're doing it across the lifespan, and so I would have to pull the thread with my counterparts that work in this space in mental health. But one area that has improved, maybe, you tell me, since your last mental health roundtable, has been something that we worked on with Mr. Curtis called early and consistent contact. And what it looks something like this. You're in your last 12 months of active duty, and you're preparing to leave, and you're preparing to think about your first 12 months of being a veteran and no longer wearing the uniform, and contact proactively outbound by the VA to the service member early. So they're studying out what the right time frame is. It's within that 12-month window. It might be at the 9-month mark. Don't quote me, but it might be at the 6-month mark. And then consistent contact throughout your whole first year into your veteran status with caring outreach and checking in. Are your benefits good? Is your health care good? Are social aspects good? They have a particular script that's probably written much better than the way I'm explaining it, but it is caring outreach, and it is designed to have folks build the bridge between the DoD and the VA and make sure there's no divide and occur consistently over time in such a way that we have that safety net It's not eyes on, it's not a physical exam, which I think is what you would like to see. So I'll take that back to action with my staff and check. I'm not all the way sure if there's been traction on that or not, but I think it is a good idea. And this other piece around, I just offer to you, like, equally so I hear this from my father as well, who is active duty Navy from 1970 to 1994, and all that I talk about work, it's a different Navy. I offer that we just have to get, where do we get them, which is your question, where they are.
Contact. They socialize differently.
Yes.
There's a lot more phone.
Yes. Yes, and so I just offer that we have to take it to them, and we have to study that cohort and bring it to them, vice sitting the way we might have, and they came to us, and they would come to the annual town hall, or they would come to the VFW meeting. Like, we need to go to them wherever they are, and I'm not an expert on where they are, but we should meet them where they're at. Yeah, I don't know if you have other thoughts on that in terms of the.
Yeah, a little bit. I'd like to thank both of the questioners for their service. But you know, it's interesting when we speak. You know, the veterans like to organize together, socialize together, and that's all part of that mutual support and that peer support. We kind of grew up with the veterans organizations being, you know, the VFW and ones that we all, you know, kind of knew, and they grew up out of the conscription force as well. But the veterans that are the newer veterans have come from the all-volunteer force, and much like the active duty has changed, you know, some of the veterans organizations are changing as well. So you have ones like the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, and I think they probably interact with their members a little bit differently than maybe the VFW, you know, interacts with theirs. It's kind of a different generation. So the veteran community is changing as well. And that's good for us because we need to interact with anybody that represents a veteran. Again, it's all part of that larger team. But I think some of those veterans organizations are doing exactly what you want. I mean, that's how they get their membership, is they have to interact with their members in a whole different way than we've been used to.
And I can certainly comment on that as well. And it is finding them where they are. And we offer a lot of programming that's designed specifically to bring them in. We really focus on events that are appealing, those fun activities that first get them in the door to connect with each other, establish those peer relationships and connections. But then the next layer is then connecting them with those critical programs and services that can address the mental health, the physical health, or the financial or educational challenges that they're facing. And we leverage technology in a variety of different ways through emails and updates in those events, but it's really enticing them and then leveraging each other to bring them along to those events so that they can get into the fold of all that we do have to offer.
And by the way, just one clarifying point before we go to a second round, and Melanie or General Linnington, correct me if I'm wrong, but just to clarify and maybe just belabor the obvious, a lot of your populations did not serve in Iraq or Afghanistan. They might have served somewhere else. They may or may not have been deployed. We saw that most have been deployed, but not all. And they may or may not have been wounded in a classic sort of battlefield sense. They may have become sick. And so your populations cover people who suffer challenges from causes all over the world and from more than sort of, you know, the classic image of the battlefield injury. That's a fair statement.
Yes, there is a variety, but as you mentioned, that the vast majority have seen combat experience and have had multiple deployments, and as a result, 90% of those that we serve have 3 or more injuries or illnesses related to their service.
Yes, ma'am. We've got a question here in the 4th row, and then we'll come over also to the 2nd row before coming back to the panel.
Hi, Kim Danick, U.S. Army retired, and my colleague James Murray. We're both from the Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Child Support Enforcement. And we take a look at the challenge survey that the VA has of homeless veterans, because what we see is that a lot of veterans, and correct me if I'm wrong, what we see at the state, local, and tribal levels is that the veterans are getting ready to transition from active duty, don't realize that they can reach out to child support services to look for modifications of child support orders, or they've got a difficult child support order because they got divorced in South Carolina and now nobody lives in South Carolina. One's in North Dakota and the other's in New York State. Other veterans are worried because they're in arrears and don't want to reach out to a child support office or organization because they feel like they're going to be put in jail. some of our state and local offices go to stand down events that state and local agencies hold. Do you have any metrics from your survey on the veterans that ask about financial problems? Because we get veterans who are suicidal and we direct them to the suicide hotline because they think there's no recourse. And so we try and build partnerships with organizations to get those child support issues and those legal issues solved. Sorry, it's rather long, but kind of complicated.
And pretty important. Thank you. And here as well, and then we'll come back to the
Yes, good morning. I'm Amy Looney with the Travis Manning Foundation. My question really lies, I think it's wonderful, the discussion that we had around employment and the factors that play a key role into that for our warriors. For the veterans that we're serving as well, we always find that it's great that they get jobs, but there's a huge difference between a career and a job. And have we given some additional thought and insight around what the retention is for them within these roles? What is the impact and what are the challenges that are presented when they can't stay in these same roles for a select period of time?
Thank you. Should we just start with Melanie this time and work down?
Sure, absolutely. So to address the question of looking at where do those that we serve fall on their financial spectrum, what we're seeing is a positive trend of warriors reporting that their financial situation is either the same or better. This year we had 71% making that endorsement in a very positive light of that things are improving or at least maintaining the same, so we're not seeing it slope back down. As far as the specifics of challenges that they're facing, the closest that we get to looking at that in the survey is looking at their monthly household debt and those expenses that they are incurring in addition to mortgages and car payments. As far as the data goes, I haven't seen any red flags that are suggesting that there's major challenges with respect to that may put them in the situation that you spoke about. However, one area that we specifically assess is looking at the debt to income ratio as far as looking at potential viability for mortgages. And we do see that number does fluctuate a little bit high, indicating that there may be some opportunities for enhanced financial readiness. And in particular, one of the scales that we do use, the area of greatest opportunities focuses around savings and making sure that there's kind of a cushion there. So I'm not sure that directly addresses your question, but that's the best that we have as far as the data goes.
Tony?
And it's a great question about the jobs versus the career. And we know when folks transition from uniform into the civilian world, and of course I've learned this from Keita over the years, the number one protective factor, and we talk about protective factors to build up individuals' resilience, so no matter what they face, they're prepared to face it. That number one protective factor is a job. And that's why the whole transition that we have is so focused on employment. And probably rightfully so. But in addition to that, we've now started to talk more about the socially protective factors, the sense of belonging. You lose some of that sense of mission, the esprit de corps, the camaraderie that you have from a uniform way of life. But I would say, rightfully so, the focus is still on getting people that first job that they want. For many of them, it's going to school on the GI Bill. It may be others. And I will say that we lose a little bit of a track of them once they've made that transition and they have that job. But just like the rest of civilian society, people change jobs, every 3 or 4 years. It's kind of, the average. And so I think they kind of become, more civilian, if you will, in that regard. They're not going to have necessarily that 20-year career that they may have had in uniform or wanted in uniform. And so we do lose a little bit of track of them, but that's when it kind of becomes that all-hands effort that I talked about in getting the community involved, because now they are just like their civilian counterparts. They'll have worked somewhere for some period of time, and now it's time to make that transition. And in addition to that, just all of our work on their financial readiness, so they know how, going into that, they can build up their finances, and if they choose to make a career change, that they're in a financial position to do so.
And similarly, I'm trained through the school of Mr. Curtis. So, I mean, what he has shared is spot on what I would share. It's interesting, though, for the Wounded Warrior, for the future survey. And I don't know how the question is asked about employment, but if it's targeted around employment and then meaningful employment, And also your organization, Travis Manthan, just in terms of if we can't get them meaning and purpose through employment because sometimes practicality kicks in and you have to take a job in order to just, meet your current, then can we get you meaning and purpose through volunteer-based civic organizations? And service members are so civic-minded. And so I mean, it's important for everybody to leave the room to know that if someone has a job and they don't have meaning and purpose in it, then maybe we can get them involved in an organization like yours or something else in the community, Red Cross or something. Because financial risk factors is important, and we do see it more and more playing out in our data. And that wasn't always the case when I first came into the field. We early in the field thought that this was largely a medical problem and a mental health problem, and sometimes divorce came into play or something. But now, falling from glory and trouble with your finances, it can be an important risk factor. So I appreciate the question. And this question about child support as well is a good one. And it's the first time I've heard something like this. And if we've not lashed up well between the child support capability office and the DoD office that handles transition and the VA office, I'm happy to help make those connections so that service members leaving the DoD are aware of the help and the assistance to track their child support in a proper way over time, particularly as it applies to changing income and moving states. I know that if we've not done that yet, it's something that we can do. I don't know if you're familiar, if that's in the TAP curriculum already, or
I don't know if it's actually in the TAP curriculum, but it's certainly something that we can partner with HHS on to make sure that it is.
I'm going to allow myself one. Oh, we'll come back. Go ahead, please, Claire.
Sorry, just to follow up, the state of California, the area of San Diego, their child support office specifically has an incredibly robust outreach program because they have so many transitioning people that they don't realize when they transition, their child support doesn't necessarily decrease with their monthly income coming in. And it's such a big area that they have Army, Navy, Air Force all transitioning out, Marines. So they actually they hold stand-down events where they can have people there to go through the process. And what we find is at these stand-down events, if the homeless veteran is screened and they say that they have a legal concern, then they can sort of be filtered to the child support organization without fear of being arrested or their driver's license being revoked, or that they can get a driver's license back. So San Diego is a great area for that.
That's good. We'll have to take your card with my teams here, and we'll follow up with you. Thank you.
Great. Let's see if we have time for another round or two. And any more questions, thoughts? These have been outstanding questions. Gentleman over here.
Good afternoon. My name is Lopez Carter, Colonel, retired United States Army, and I currently work as a strategic planning analyst with the Army National Guard. Back in 2003, 15 years ago, I assumed command of 2nd Battalion, 8th Cav in 1st Cavalry Division and deployed my battalion to Baghdad, Iraq. My tankers, I had 16 tanks, and the rest of us were dragoons. I did not send my Humvees anywhere without sending my tanks first. And they experienced a lot of IED explosions. Now, the Army's concussion protocol was non-existent then. Right. As a matter of fact, we make jokes about it. How many times did you get knocked out? How many times did you get blown up? I had one soldier who we considered his tank an IED magnet. I don't know how he survived. He was exposed to so many explosions. Fast forward a few years, and I'm out of battalion command. I'm working in Brussels, Belgium. And I get contacted by these soldiers who are now veterans, who now have serious traumatic brain injuries. Some of them so bad they're physically shaking. It took a Herculean effort on the part of myself, my then brigade commander, General Abrams, and my then division commander, General Corelli, to get them Purple Hearts. Now, to get them the compensation that they deserved as a result of that injury was a far greater challenge, because these are soldiers who got out, who did not have a medical history because they did not have symptoms when they got out. These symptoms developed later. Or if they had symptoms, they didn't associate it with the explosions that they experienced in Baghdad. And the VA has to, because I am a wounded warrior. I have physical injuries, but I also have injuries that are not visible. And the VA wants you to link that to your service. There's no way I can do that. I don't know how to do that. They're having the same challenges. So what are we doing to help these soldiers who have gotten out, who did not identify a medical problem, but has subsequently developed a problem? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Great question. Anybody else want to pose one more? We'll maybe make this the final round, and then.
Or answer that one.
Yes, right, exactly. Help us answer that one. It's so moving.
It's a tough one.
Joe.
I have one for.
And by the way, shout out to Joe Plensler, who's a very longstanding good friend and a Marine himself, and now with the Wounded Warrior Project.
Thanks, Mike. I have one for Mr. Curta. On the recruiting side of the business, as you're sitting in the Pentagon, what are you seeing from the youth of America today as far as propensity and eligibility to serve, especially after we've been at war for 17 years, the economy's doing well? Just had a question about your thoughts about where are we going down the road on the recruiting side?
And then we'll see if there's any final question, and then we will make this the last round. Anybody else want to get in? And if not, we'll come back to the panel. Going once, going twice. Okay, so Tony, you want to begin with that round and the last question, and then we'll go to Melanie and then.
And first, Colonel, thank you for your service. And I mean, it's kind of why we are here discussing all of this today. It's not easy. The wounds of war are not apparent always at the time of transition. You highlighted that very poignantly. And that's why, the Veterans Affairs Department is here. It's why the Defense Department is here. It's why the Wounded Warrior Project is here. And all of these people. It's not easy. Yet, as I said, it is not only something that we owe those that have served, but it's just as integral to the future of the all volunteer force and the recruiting and the propensity to serve that I'll talk about in a moment. But I don't minimize the amount of work that we all have to do to take care of those that have served. My brother, he was both a Marine and an Army veteran, and he got out some years ago. And again, his service-related disabilities weren't apparent at that time, so he approaches the VA afterwards. So I mean, I understand how I talk to him all the time and get all of the ins and out of dealing with the two largest bureaucracies in the department. The Department of Defense and the Department of Veterans Affairs. But fortunately, we have people like everybody in this room that want to help those service members navigate those two bureaucracies and ensure that the compact we made with them is fulfilled. And again, it goes back to the point I made, Michael, at the very beginning in relation to your question, and how well we do, not just DOD, not just VA, but all of us here, the entire citizenry, how well we do with this, keeping the sacred trust, will ensure that we're able to recruit people in the future. It is a family business. The people that serve today, that volunteer to serve, are largely those people that have immediate family members that are in uniform or have served in uniform. It becomes kind of a decreasingly small radius circle of people that choose to serve, and we have to break out of that, at some point for the future of the all volunteer force, because 80% of our young people today, age 17 to 24, are not eligible to serve for some reason. They either have physical problems, mental issues, they have conduct issues. Now, of those 20%, how many are propense to serve? Because those in uniform are unfortunately not as apt as they were in the past to recommend future service. All of our influencers, we call them, our coaches, our priests, our counselors, those that have been in uniform, moms and dads, grandparents, aren't recommending service as much as they used to it. And part of that is the perception, after 17 years of war, that people that serve come out and they're ill or injured, they have post-traumatic stress, they have trouble finding jobs, they have physical disabilities. That kind of takes over the narrative. And it's true, and it's why we are here today to focus on those folks that have wounds from their service. But the vast majority of people that serve for some period of time, serve successfully, and make a successful transition and integrate back into the community. And we need to highlight both of those. We need to keep the compact alive and be true to those that have wounded, and we need to make sure that the rest of those who serve successfully integrate back into society, because propensity is not up, especially in a booming economy where unemployment is below 4% and youth employment is below 10% or around there. And just by the nature of society, people are less and less meet the physical and mental and conduct standards that we have. So it's, as I said at the beginning, the state of the all-volunteer force is strong today. There are some warning clouds on the horizon that we're all paying attention to. But again, it goes back to, if we're all those concerned citizens, have those dialogues, get to know those in uniform and our veterans, it will help the future generation know about the value of service, and it will help us in the propensity and the ability of folks to join, and we need them to do that. Thank you.
Super, thank you. Keita, do you want to go next, and then we'll finish with Melanie?
Sure. This also, I thought, was such a well-phrased question about this issue of having physical and or emotional injuries that are not identified until after the fact. I think one of the first strides that we've had to take over the years is for people to recognize the delayed onset of these symptoms, and that it can and will occur across the lifespan. And there is no definitive time that sort of says you've experienced a blast and you'll either have injuries on Tuesday or not. Like the delayed onset, it happens over time, and it's unique and distinct for each and every person. And so I, too, was a social worker during the heat of the time that you described, and I think that the DoD made great strides first on defining what is a blast, what is a traumatic brain injury, what are our appropriate protocols, drawing from the best in the field at the time. I know I was working at the headquarter element for the Marine Corps, and then General Dunford was in deep on the literature himself on blast injury protocols and the like, and all of those lessons now need to continue to be applied over the lifespan of a veteran, whenever the symptoms come up. And so I've tried to take great opportunity to educate not just the mental health community about that, but the benefits-based people, the veteran service organizations that help navigate those systems in such a way that people have at least a keen understanding of the role of trauma in people's life and when they've been exposed to trauma and how that impacts them over time. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of experience, and so we must be ready to engage when it comes to us and apply the right services accordingly. So I think that you phrased it so well, and we shouldn't stop. 10 years after the fact, if there becomes a known issue tied back to a traumatic event, that's when we're ready. So.
I think that the awareness and recognition that there are the delayed onset effects of the various injuries that are being incurred, and we are actually seeing this trend as we are having a greater transition of active duty to veteran status of those that we directly serve. We're also seeing a nice parallel, though, of those that we serve increasing in the percentage of that receive a VA disability. 90% of those that we serve are currently receiving VA disability, with the vast majority of those at 80% or higher. And also the numbers that are at 100% are continuing to increase. That doesn't mean that the problem is solved. However, that is an area where we have devoted a lot of resources working internally and in collaboration with others in the space to work to get those that are entitled these benefits, regardless of when the injury occurred and when the symptoms have emerged, to get the benefits that they are entitled to.
So before I ask you to join me in thanking this panel, as well as all the military and veterans families that are gathered with us today and following this event in some other way, I wanted to invite Renee Bartok, who's a Senior Vice President with Wounded Warrior Project, up to the stage. She has a final word or two in commemoration here.
Well, let me first say thank you so very much for all of you coming today. It's been a wonderful event. And Mike, we wanted to present you a nice gift from the Wounded Warrior Project. It says, for your fidelity to those who defend our great nation, and not just to our wounded warriors, but to all service members and veterans and their families, and for the work that you do here at Brookings, and for the panels that you host, so all of us can learn more about how to better care for those who bear the burdens of war, but those also who will serve our country now and in the future, and who have served. So on behalf of Wounded Warrior Project, we would like to present you with this.
It's an honor for all of us. Thank you. Thank you. Very kind. Thank you so much.
And I would say the same too for Keita and for Tony. Keita, for your work first at the Marine Corps, which is very near and dear to our hearts at Wounded Warrior Project. Most of our warriors, obviously all of our warriors have served, but most of those who work inside Wounded Warrior Project are also warriors or family members, those who have served and those who have lost. And so for us, your work is so important to all of us, and your connection to us and your collaboration with us. We sit on that executive branch panel with you. We work every day with your team at the VA, and we're in this together, and we're so proud of our relationship and the work we do together. So thank you so very much.
Thank you.
And finally, Tony, who is just such a wonderful friend to Mike and I both. Our time at OSD together for many years, working these issues together, and your unprecedented support of our force. We can't thank you enough, both for your time in service and for what you do at the Department of Defense every day. You're a great friend to us, and because of your work, there are thousands of people who will serve successfully, and there are thousands of lives that will be saved by the policies that you've put in place for our warriors and their families. So I thank you so very much for everything you've done in service to our country.
Too kind.
So with that, we'll wrap up, and I want to thank you again all for coming. And if there's any additional questions, we'll be here for a little bit longer, so feel free to come up and ask us.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.